Welcome to Environmental Law Explored, a podcast series, the podcast of the American Bar Association section of Environment, Energy, and Resources.
This is the Forest Resources Committee podcast. I'm Andrew Kihn. In this episode, we will be discussing wildfire policy. To be sure, it's a broad topic. Throughout the history of this country, and long before, wildfires have been a fact of life in North America, particularly in the West. But in recent years, the frequency and intensity of wildfires have grown considerably. Year after year, and one after another, catastrophic conflagrations devastate communities. Earlier this year, wildfires in and around Los Angeles took at least 29 lives and destroyed more than 16,000 structures. As we are recording this episode in March, deadly and destructive wildfires blaze through Oklahoma. Calls to address the crisis resound universally. Ideas about just what that looks like, however, vary widely. Some would buttress zoning laws and building codes. Others would increase timber harvest and wildfire suppression efforts. And others still would divert additional water resources towards wildfire-prone areas. To help contextualize these issues and to walk us through some readily available policy solutions to them, we are lucky to be joined by Doug Green, manager of the Community Planning Assistance for Wildfire program at Headwaters Economics, an independent nonprofit that conducts research and provides development and land management recommendations to community stakeholders and local, state, and federal decision makers across the United States. Doug, thanks for joining us.
Thanks for having me, Andrew.
Diving into the wildfire policy discourse can be overwhelming. A good place to start might be to understand just how the wildfire crisis came to be. So, my first question for you today is, how did we get here? Why is the crisis as bad as it is? And why do attempts to tackle it seem to prove so divisive?
Yeah, boy, that's starting off with a loaded question for sure. And there's not a simple answer for this. It's, as you said, the wildfire crisis is a complex issue that stems from really a confluence of factors that have been building for years and years. Initially we have this historical piece. For much of the 20th century, the dominant approach to wildfire was suppression. In the past, we believed that we could overcome the increasing wildfire problem through increased suppression efforts and resources. Basically, let's buy more fire trucks, hire more firefighters, and we can solve this problem. Obviously, we now know that this is not the case. And this well-intentioned effort led to this huge buildup in fuels in our forest, dead trees, brush, vegetation, that has caused, essentially, us building up a giant tinderbox. At Headwaters, we call this the wildfire paradox, which refers to the counterintuitive situation where efforts to suppress wildfires have actually led to an increase of larger, more intense fires in the long run. And in addition to the historical context of how we managed our forests, we have climate change. We're experiencing hotter, drier conditions, longer fire seasons, and more extreme weather events, which creates this perfect storm for larger, more intense wildfires. And the science is clear, right? Climate change is a significant driver of this crisis. Third issue that we always talk about at Headwaters is this expansion of development into wildfire-prone lands. And I think we're all aware of this. More and more people are living in or near wildfire-prone areas, putting themselves and their property at greater risk. Not only does this increase the risk to the folks in the communities in those areas, but it increases the complexity of managing wildfires. How do you protect lives and homes of folks that live in these high wildfire areas? And finally, and I think we'll touch on this later, is this really complex policy and political landscape we have right now. Wildfire management is inherently complex. It involves multiple agencies, jurisdictions, and stakeholders. There's often competing interests here and values at play that lead to disagreements about, and I think you said this earlier, Andrew, the best course of action to solve this problem. And especially in today's polarized climate, even the most well-intentioned policies can easily become battlegrounds, and the science is often hidden underneath political type rhetoric. So we have a legacy of fire suppression, climate change, increased development, and a complex public policy landscape. And I think it becomes so divisive because there are not easy answers to this. There's always trade-offs. People have different priorities with different values. Some want to focus on protecting homes, others restoring the ecological balance, and still others the economic considerations come into play. So finding a common ground is extremely challenging, but it is essential if we're going to make any progress into this wildfire crisis.
Thank you for laying that helpful foundation. So as you mentioned, the wildland-urban interface, where the built environment and wildland areas meet, is growing. And by many estimates, more than 1/3 of Americans today live in the WEI. This is significant, particularly in light of spiking home insurance rates and an exodus of insurers in wildfire-prone areas. Even where insurance remains available, prices can be prohibitive. Generally, lenders require that prospective homeowners have home insurance as a condition of securing a mortgage, and more, uninsured and underinsured homeowners that lose their homes to wildfires are finding that they are unable to afford to rebuild. In order for communities to continue to exist viably, safely, and sustainably in these areas, changes need to be made. When you approach a community, and in particular, a community reluctant to deviate from the status quo, where do you start? How do you bridge these divides we've been discussing, separating the multitude of interest groups that share stakes in a community and find common ground?
So first of all, when we go into a community, our role is not to convince the community to do one thing or another. At Headwaters Economics and at the CPAW program that I manage for Headwaters, we've worked with over 85 communities across the country, and each community is completely different than the other one. As you can imagine, what I would recommend to somebody, let's say, in eastern Colorado or Florida is far different than recommendations we would make to a place in Southern California. Southern California in general, is used to ordinances, used to codes. They accept that as part of how their government works, where in other parts of the country, they really value the private property rights aspect of it. So there's no easy solution. There's no one solution that fits for every community. For us, it's going into a community, understanding their risks, making sure they understand their risks. In a lot of communities we go into, what they view as their wildfire risks are not actually what the data and maps support. So helping educate them what their risks are. And again, there's a lot of tools in that toolbox, and finding the ones that it's palatable to that community at that time in their political climate that they feel can make a difference. I like to use the phrase, better is better than best. There's these perfect scenarios we'd love to see every community be in when it comes to reducing their wildfire risk. But in most cases, that's not what a community is willing to accept. But if we can help them make small steps toward reducing their risk, then that's a step forward for us. And so bridging that gap between the different stakeholders, a great example is we worked in Austin, Texas a few years ago. Austin, Texas obviously has a very significant wildfire risks and a very diverse population with a lot of different priorities. They had some significant wildfires in the late 2015 era time and decided that they wanted to adopt a WUI code down there. They knew it wasn't going to be easy. Texas is obviously, they value their private property rights, but by understanding that they could bring in different stakeholder groups that were non-traditional in the wildfire sense, they were able to get it done. They reached out to the Real Estate Council, the Home Builders Association, the Board of Realtors of Austin, help them understand that this was a critical piece for their business as well and for the well-being of Austin, brought them in there, and they helped support Austin adopting a wildland-urban interface code for the entire city, which was a huge step forward. We also helped Austin understand that what they believed to be their highest wildfire risks actually may not have been their highest risk, that they actually had communities within Austin, low-income communities that English wasn't their first language, that actually had a higher wildfire risk than places that they initially thought. So we were able to help them reallocate some of their resources, bring in these non-traditional communities, and be advocates for reducing the wildfire risk.
Now to the heart of things. As you mentioned, solutions will be custom tailored and each community is different. But drawing out common threads, what fundamentally are the policies that you find yourself recommending to best prepare communities for wildfire?
Well, yeah, again, there is a a lot of tools in the toolbox. And I always I came from 25 years as a structural firefighter. And I remember when I was in the fire service, again, we felt that suppression was how you dealt with this problem. And I've always used the phrase that, when a hammer is the only tool you have in your toolbox, everything looks like a nail. But if we understand there's a lot of tools out there and a lot of different solutions, that's how we can find ways to help communities manage their risk. And so at the Community Planning Assistance for Wildfire program, we really focus on trying to mitigate this risk on the front end. We look at reducing a community's risk through the lens of land use planning. So we analyze land use codes and ordinances. We look at city plans, community wildfire protection plans, hazard mitigation plans, often their comp plan or general plan. Any regulatory document they have within their community, and some of them may be housed in the fire department or in public works or in development standard specs. We review all those and look for ways and, again, opportunities in those where we can help that community reduce their risk. And we also need to make sure that those documents and those visions for a community align with each other. We find in a lot of communities, if they have, let's say, heritage trees ordinances or riparian zone ordinances, et cetera, they are sometimes counterintuitive to actually reducing the wildfire risk. And in many cases, we can find ways to bridge those gaps, let them maintain what's valuable to their community, but still reduce the wildfire risk. In some cases, it's something like Austin did, which is implementing an entire wildland-urban interface code. But in a lot of cases, it's simple things that make a huge difference. An example would be a lot of communities in their, let's say, development code, they have standards that require screening between, let's say, a commercial parking lot and a residential subdivision. And that may require them to put a 6-foot high fence up with some landscaping to block that vision between the two different zones. And if we can go in there and allow them to do that, but maybe require that fence be non-combustible and the landscaping be non-flammable, and that simple language change right there reduces the risk considerably to that community, because we know fences and landscaping is that conduit that can result in structure-to-structure ignition, which then can result in the conflagration and destroying of communities. So if we can break that continuity with non-combustible fencing, non-flammable vegetation, something simple like that in a development code can reap huge benefits. And there's dozens and dozens of examples of those scattered throughout cities and communities and county codes. And communities want to do the right thing, but a lot of times they're just unaware because a lot of those staffs and departments end up being kind of siloed. They don't talk to each other, and they don't realize that what they're requiring may not be the best for hazard mitigation in that community. And can I add one more thing, Andrew, on that?
Absolutely.
Policies are important, and our recommendations are important, and the science is important, but what we find when we go into communities is that policies alone will not get us there. And the big piece of this that we find more and more is that social science is as important as the fire science piece. Understanding how people actually perceive risks and helping a community understand its real risks is vital to this conversation. Because until a community understands the actual risk to them, to their family, to their community, getting policies changed and codes adopted is at a minimum extremely challenging, if not impossible. Community needs to find the value in these proposed changes for themselves and take it upon themselves to require their decision makers and their leaders to make these hard and tough choices that's best for the community. But it's often interesting when we go into communities and we start asking them about their perceived risks. Many communities, and through science and data we know are at extremely high risk of wildfire, many of these communities underestimate their risk or feel like it's not going to happen to them, it'll happen to somebody else. So we see this over and over and over again. And if you look at fires in Southern California, you can see where there's multiple places where fires have burned through a community. They have rebuilt in the same place. It has burned through a second time and they've rebuilt again. And it's just human nature to kind of forget about the past and think that it's not going to happen to them. And so if we can help these communities understand that social science piece, help them understand the real risks and what's at stake here, that is really the biggest challenge. Once they understand that, they, in most cases, want to do the right thing. And the policy adoption, the code change pieces, that becomes the easy part.
Thank you for all your insights in fielding such a difficult question. Turning our attention now to the federal government, presently, Congress is weighing a handful of bills designed to address the wildfire crisis. To name a few, the Fix Our Forests Act would, among other things, under emergency authorities, expedite and expand timber harvest on federal forest lands within fireshed management areas, providing for 10,000-acre categorical exclusions from NEPA, National Historic Preservation Act review, and delaying NEPA and ESA review of timber harvest activities in those firesheds until after their implementation. The Wildfire Emergencies Act 2025 would, inter alia, enable the USFS to leverage private financing for forest restoration projects and expand the DOE Weatherization Grant Program to provide up to $13,000 to low-income households for wildfire hardening retrofits. What other ideas would you be interested in seeing advanced on the federal level?
I'll speak briefly to the two bills you mentioned there. I'm not an expert on either of them, but I think I can share some insights from our point of view. And we look at whether it's these bills or anything else that comes down from the federal level, our focus is always what will these do at the community? What impact will they have at the community level? You know, what are these really going to do to help reduce the risk of wildfire at the community scale? You know, the Fix Our Forests Act, with its emphasis on expedited timber harvest and broad NEPA exclusions, raises concerns for us on what it's actually going to do to reduce a wildfire risk. You know, we understand and support the need to address fuel loads in the forest, but blanket exceptions don't address the real threat to communities. And I think this is something that reiterate often because I think there is still, even with the recent fires, still a misconception about how communities burn. There is a public perception that in most cases it is caused by a huge inferno coming out of the forest or public lands, raining down upon a community, and there's nothing we can do to stop it. You know, and the only way to solve this problem is to thin and, cut our forests. And again, we know there's value in thinning. We know there's value in prescribed burning and logging for sure. But in most cases, we are not losing communities to fires that start deep in our forests. You know, we lose communities from wildfire from ignitions that originate either adjacent to or within our communities. This is not a forest fire problem. This is a structural ignition problem. And increasing timber harvest away from communities is not going to solve the wildfire crisis when it comes to communities, right? These fires start next to or within communities, drop embers onto the community, landscaping and homes that are not built to certain wildfire standards ignite. Then you have multiple structures igniting. You add wind to that. Fire suppression efforts are immediately overwhelmed. Then you have structure-to-structure ignition, and that's how you lose communities. So this is not, in most cases, a forest fire issue. So spending money and time, as we have over the past decades, on huge forest removal practices, although they may be good in other ways, ecologically, economically, etc., those do not, in most cases, reduce the risk of wildfire to a community. The focus needs to be on funding and supporting the actual risk. Fuel reduction projects adjacent to and within communities. And this is why CWPPs, or Community Wildfire Protection Plans, are so important. They can highlight those areas surrounding communities where fuel reduction treatments, logging, prescribed burns can be extremely valuable to reducing that risk to the community. But we also need to provide funding for retrofits of existing homes. Because as we saw in California, the recent California fires, the majority of the homes that burnt there were built before the Chapter 7A California Code went into effect in 2008. And so these were homes that had not been built to current wildfire standards. So we need to fund retrofits of existing homes, and this needs to come from the federal level. Local and state coffers cannot afford to fund this significant amount of retrofits that need to take place in these wildfire-prone areas. And we also, at the federal level, need to support policies that require building and development to meet current science and standards that address this wildfire risks. So, although there may be some value in that bill when it comes to community risk reduction of wildfires, it seems to be missing the mark from what we can tell at this early stage of this. In referencing the other bill you talked about, the weatherization bill that provides up to $13,000 to low-income housing, we feel that's a great first step, especially for low-income housing. But we also understand that $13,000 does not go very far to retrofitting a house to wildfire standards, especially with rising construction costs. We know that low-income groups are far more impacted from natural hazards like wildfire than other communities. So again, we think this is a good step, but it's going to take a lot more than $13,000 per household to make a significant difference. We need to make sure these grants are paired with community level planning for wildfire hardening, because again, this isn't a single structure ignition problem. This is a community-wide problem. And until we start addressing it at a community scale through part of what we do, codes and ordinances, things like that, but also in other ways, till communities can start looking at this at a community scale, we are not going to be able to solve this problem. Obviously, wildfire does not know property lines, city limits, municipal boundaries. And so we need to step back a little bit and try to solve this problem from the federal level down at a community scale. Additionally, you ask what else would we like to see from the federal level? I think support and funding are the biggest two things we could see that would help when we deal with communities on a daily basis. They want to do the right thing. They just don't have access to technical assistance. They don't have the capacity. A lot of times there are small fire departments or small planning departments that are overwhelmed and are overworked with the load they have right now. And asking them to take on the wildfire piece is beyond what they can do right now. So they need, again, technical assistance and capacity building. They need funding to help them do CWPPs, such as the community wildfire defense grants that came out. And those were significant and important steps for communities to update their CWPPs and try to implement some of the projects in current CWPPs. That grant itself probably made the biggest difference to communities at a local scale than anything has in the recent past. And the other piece would be trying to expand and make it easier for communities to find that funding. There are BRIC grants out there that do help communities with some of this funding, but they are extremely unwielding to apply for and manage, especially for small departments. And they need to be expanded to work better for wildfire. So I think from the federal level, if there could be one place where community wildfire protection funding, resources, knowledge are housed, would be a huge help to a community where they knew where there was one place they could go and get the help and funding that they needed to solve the solutions at the community scale.
Thank you very much, Doug. Is there anything else you'd like to add before we sign off?
For me, it's always sounds fairly doom and gloom, especially with the fires we've had recently. I mean, there's definitely a lot of risk and a lot of problems we're facing right now, and the future of funding and how this is going to look into the future is extremely challenging and disconcerting, but trying to leave an optimistic note. I always like to kind of bring up something from the wildfire historian Steve Pine, who's worked with us at Headwaters for a lot of years. And he talks about how we know in the past how to solve these problems. There were early 1900s, late 1800s, we lost many large cities in this country through giant fires that swept through those communities. Chicago, San Francisco, etc., that would burn through these communities, killed people and destroyed entire communities. And we learned from that, and we developed codes, and we figured out that if we didn't build sidewalks out of wood, if we provided fire escapes, if we built buildings with exits in them, we could save people's lives. If we stopped using sawdust for insulation and put maybe alarms in and hydrants, we could save people's lives and keep these communities from burning down. And we started thoughtfully designing our urban areas with fire in mind. And we don't see those type of devastating disasters anymore in these large cities. And now when we go into buildings and we see fire escapes, we see fire alarms and emergency exits, we take them for granted. We understand why they're there. And I always like to say that we need to remember most codes are built on the backs of tragedy. People died, people understood why that happened, and they wrote code so it wouldn't happen in the future. And we know how to do that with wildfire. We know the science. We know how communities burn down. We know how structures ignite other structures. The science is proven. Now, again, it's a social science piece. We need to take these tragedies from the past and the recent past and translate those into what we know. We know that certain building codes and landscape codes make a difference. And it's going to be hard, and it's going to take leaders that have the fortitude and the strength to make those tough decisions. But, just like other codes that whether it be earthquake codes and hurricane type codes and energy efficiency codes, those are put in place for a reason, and wildfire codes are no different. So we know the solution here. We know how to solve this problem. We just need to take the next steps to do that. And we're slowly and surely making those strides forward, but we can't lose that momentum and that steam and continue to make this matter so that the tragedies in Lahaina, the tragedies with the Marshall Fire and the Paradise Fire and what happened in LA don't go unnoticed, and we use those to learn to make future changes that can make communities safer.
Doug, thank you very much for your time.
Thank you, Andrew. Appreciate being on here, and thank you for having me.
We hope you enjoyed today's episode. To learn more about our section, please visit our website at americanbar.org/enviro. Please check where you found us for future episodes. Thank you for listening.